Welcome to this full stack tutorial. We're going to be building a small application using Flask and Postgres on the back end and React in the front end. For this video, we're going to focus on getting our back end set up. So a couple things that you need to make sure you've got installed. Number one is Python. In this video, at the time of recording, Python 3.10.0 is the latest, so that's what I'll be using. Make sure you've got Postgres installed as well and follow the directions for your operating system. I'd also recommend leaving pgadmin checked because I'm going to be using that. It's an interface that allows us to interact with our database directly through a GUI. And then Postman is a tool I'll be using. You can see a screenshot of it here, but basically it lets you test your API endpoints in this interface. Which is super helpful when you've only got a back end set up. So as far as our project structure, so recently had a little baby and I've got to track lots of fun things like diapers and bottles. And so I'm going to be using that as inspiration for this project. So I've got this baby tracker application or directory rather set up. And then within it, I've got a back end directory with nothing in it. For our front end, I'm just going to add that directory as well, and that'll house our React app. You can structure this however you want. You can make them separate entire directories if that's how you want to do it. But for this project, I'm just going to keep it all in this one kind of parent directory. So I'm in the backend directory, and before we start, make sure that you've got pipenv installed. So pip install will install packages globally on your machine and make them accessible anywhere. Pipenv, if you're like me and you're coming from a JavaScript background, is kind of similar to like how package.json is set up using npm or yarn. So this is going to tie our dependencies to this project specifically rather than having those dependencies just kind of float in no man's land. So I've already installed this. I'm not going to run that, but go ahead and install pipenv if you don't have it. And then to activate it, we'll run pipenv shell. And it looks like I might have a stale virtual environment. So let me just kill this terminal. I'm in baby tracker, cd back into backend, and now run pipenv shell again. Cool. And so here's my the location for that virtual environment. Just in case, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to Control-Shift-P. And if you don't see select interpreter, this was just recently used. You can just type in Python : and then select interpreter. And we want to make sure that we're using the right virtual environment. So it gives a couple of suggestions, none of which match this backend. So what we're going to do is enter interpreter path. I'm going to paste this in and hit enter. And now you can see down at the bottom in VS Code, we've got the correct virtual environment, Python interpreter. So I'm going to run clear, and we're going to install the dependencies that we'll be using for this project. So pipenv install Flask, which is going to be our main framework that we're using. Flask SQL Alchemy, which is an ORM. So if you're familiar with like Mongoose, if you use MongoDB, for example, this is going to help us communicate with our database. Since we're using Postgres, we're going to install psychopg2 to allow us to interact with that from Flask to Postgres. We'll use python.env. So there are some scripts that you run to set up your environment, but we can create an env file that's specific to Flask that will just maintain those environment variables for us. And then the last one is Flask cores. So when we're working on this to start and we're using Postman, it's not going to be a huge deal. But eventually when we're making requests from a different local host port or eventually from our front end to our back end, we want to make sure that those requests are allowed. So we're going to use cores to do that. This cores dependency. So making sure I'm going to hit enter. Okay, now that those are installed, we can take a look at our pip file, and you can see that our packages are all here. So this was created through pipenv, and so now we can go ahead and move forward with creating our initial application. So inside of backend, we're going to create a new file called app.py. And for this tutorial, it's going to be a pretty small project, so we're just going to use this one file. So at the top, we're going to import Flask. And we're also going to import SQL Alchemy. There's some standard boilerplate, but typically looks like this. So we've got the name of our application, app equals Flask. So we're instantiating the Flask class. And then we're passing in this underscore underscore name underscore underscore. This is typically how it's going to be set up. But essentially what we're doing is just like saying, hey, Flask, like this is where our application is running. And so we're instantiating it here and passing in this underscore underscore name. So it's pretty much always going to be like that. And then we'll get our SQL Alchemy hooked in with db equals SQL Alchemy, and we'll pass in our app. Then at the bottom, we'll say if name equals underscore underscore main, then we'll run our application. And so typically here, then we could run our application, but by default, it's going to run in production mode. So I mentioned before that we're going to install python.env, and what this allows us to do is to create a Flask env file where we can have some default information. So inside of backend, I'm going to create a new file called .flaskenv, and here we're going to let Flask know the name of the app. The Flask app is app, and the environment is going to be development. Okay, so from here, now if we run this, we don't have really anything set up, but if we run this, we can run Flask run, and we can see that the environment is developed and our application is running on this is essentially localhost 5000. So if we wanted to set something up just to kind of see something in action, we're going to have our decorator here. We're going to say at app.route, and we can define a route. So we can just say like /. And then underneath that, we'll define our like route handler. So we'll say hello, we'll call it. And then we can just return a string that says, hey. So now, if I open up Postman, and I'll bring it over, and I can just create a request. By default, if we don't pass in any methods, the default is a GET request. So we can do localhost 5000 and send it, and we can see our response, hey. Pretty quick setup. So in 12 lines of code, we've got a little mini application set up already. So having it say hey is cool, but it's not really anything actually useful. So let's take this a step further. In Postgres, I mentioned we've got a tool called pgadmin, so I'm going to drag that over. And I've got a couple of databases here. So if you open it up, if you open up servers and then Postgres SQL, you should see a list of databases, and it should come with one by default Postgres, and you might see a couple of other ones in here. You'll want to make sure that you know the password that you set up, because we're going to be referring to that. But on databases, I'm going to click and say create database, and I'll say baby tracker and hit save. And so now I've got a brand new database. And so now we need to hook into that. So in our app.py, we can set up a config for SQL Alchemy. So we'll do app.config. Let's move this above, whoops. Let's move this above our DB. So app.config at SQL Alchemy underscore database underscore URI. And so for right now, that's going to equal Postgres : / and then it's going to be the user. So we're using the root user Postgres, your password. Postgres : your password at localhost / the name of our database, which is baby-tracker. And save that. The next thing that we want to do is create our model. So before we hook into our database, so we've got it set up here. We're going to create our event model. So we're just, you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it an event. So a bottle, a diaper change, whatever, I'm classifying as an event. So underneath DB, I'm going to define a class called event, and then pass in db.model. So remember, we created DB here. So passing in db.model. And then we're going to give it a couple of columns. So the first of which is going to be an ID. So we want to give it a unique identifier when we're doing things like editing and deleting and updating. Editing and updating are the same thing, but editing and updating and deleting. But it's important to have some sort of unique descriptor other than just whatever kind of string that you're passing in. So you create a column by saying db.C column, and then we're going to give it a type. The type is db.integer, and then we're going to say primary underscore key equals true. So this is we're citing this as the primary key. Next, we'll have a description, and this will be another column. And this is going to be we can say a string, and we can give it a max of like 100 characters. And this should not be nullable. So we'll say nullable is false. So we want to always have a value for description. And then we can give it a created at, just for another kind of reference point for us. So we can see db.column. And this is going to be a datetime type. We're going to say it's also not nullable. And we'll give it a default value. So we'll say default is equal to, and we're going to import datetime. So from datetime, import datetime. And so we'll say datetime.utc now. And that should be good for our columns. Then we're going to give it a string representation of itself. And we do that by saying def underscore representation, our REPR. And it gives us our VS Code just kind of auto filled this for us. But I'm going to undo that. So underscore. And then it takes in self. And we can say we'll return an F string An F string in Python just allows you to inject Python variables. So we can say event, and we'll say self.description. So this is referring to the event itself. And then we need to give it a set up our constructor. So we'll say init. And this takes in self and description. The created at and the ID. So the created at, we're giving it a default, so we're not going to worry about passing that into the constructor for this step. If you were going to get to a point where you had like an updated at, or you wanted to allow the person to enter like a specific time, then you could pass that into the constructor. But since the only thing that we're actually going to be like submitting is a description, then the description is the only piece that we need to pass into the constructor. So with self and description passed in, we can say self.description equals description. And so now our event model is set up. And so what we can do to then get this in our database is we can create a new terminal, and we can say Python to get our Python shell running. And then we can say from app import db. And let's make sure, so we're in baby tracker. Okay, gotta exit out of this, so we'll hit exit. And make sure we're in backend. And then run Python again. Whoops, Python. And we'll run from app import db. And then from here, we can run db.create_all. And what this will do is it'll create our table for us, so our event table. By default, since we didn't give this an explicit name, this table is going to be called event. So if we run this, okay, so dug in a little bit, and the issue was that my password was incorrect, and I had Postgres instead of PostgreSQL. So make sure you've got PostgreSQL and then Postgres:password at localhost / and then the name of the table. So I did run from app import db. So after killing the terminal, updating the database URI, and then running from app import db and db to create all, those ran successfully without error this time. And so if I bring over Postgres, there's baby tracker. I can hit refresh, go to schemas, and then tables. And now we have our event table. And I can view and edit data and look at all rows, and I can see an ID, a description, and created at. So let's go ahead and get some data going in our database. So we have this hello route, kind of a meaningless route. So let's go ahead and create an API route. So we can say we'll have another decorator. So we'll do app.route. And then we'll do event. So /event. Then we're going to pass in methods, a methods array. And you can pass in, since it's an array or a list, you can pass in multiple methods. I'm just going to do one method per endpoint for this, but you could potentially pass in multiple methods and use if statements if you wanted to try and consolidate. So we'll do methods, and we'll do a post request so that we can create a new event. And then we'll define it. So we'll define by saying create_event. It doesn't take in any arguments. And then we'll say we've got a description. So we can say description is equal to the request that's coming in .json. So request.json is going to give us the JSON object that's coming in, and we want to pull off the description. So request, I'm getting a squiggly line. That's because it's not imported yet. So at the top, I'm going to import request. Then going back down, so our description. So we're then going to create a variable called event. And what that's going to do is it's going to take our event class and pass in the description that we pulled off of the request. And then all we need to do is db.session.add our event. And then we need to commit it. So db.session.commit. And then what we can do is we can set up a little like formatter. So let's make a method underneath our event class, and we'll define it as format_event. It's going to take in an event, and then it's going to return an object. This object will have a description, which is going to be the event.description. It's going to have an ID, which is the event.id, and then the created at will be the event.createdAt. And so what this is allowing us to do is it'll take in our event and it'll format it so that we now have a JSON object. We can take that JSON object and pass it back to our front end so that it now has access to that information if we want to use it on the front end without making an additional network request. So going back down, we've got our commit, and then we're going to return. We'll format event, and we'll pass in the event that was just created. So again, what's happening here? We have our decorator, which is going to be hitting /event. We're passing in a post request as the method, the singular method in our requests array. And then we're defining our function. So create event. Our description is going to grab the request.json body, and we're going to grab the description off of that object. We're then going to create a variable called event, which is going to pass in the description to our event class. We're going to add that event to our session and then commit it. And then we'll return our formatted event so that, in this case, Postman, but in the future, our front end can grab that information and do something with it. So now if I switch over to Postman, I can switch this to post, and I can do /event. And in the body, we can go to raw and JSON, and we can do a description, and we can say 50 milliliter bottle. And if we send this, now we have not only our description, 50 milliliter bottle, but we've got the ID that was automatically created for us and our timestamp. And if we look in Postgres, if we refresh our event, if we view and edit data, now we can see our table now has its first row, an ID of 1, the 50 milliliter bottle, and the created at timestamp. Pretty cool. So now that we have at least one bit of information, we can start chipping away at the rest of our methods. So typically with a REST API, you're going to have create, read, update, and delete methods. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have our create event. Let's go ahead and set something up to get all of our events. So I'll comment up here, create an event, and then I'll comment that out. Here will be get all events. So we'll create our decorator, app.route /event. And in the sake of for the sake of consistency, let's call this events. So we'll post to /events. We'll get from /events. We don't have to add a method array here since get is the default, but to make it more explicit, we'll go ahead and add it. So we'll say methods equals an array and then get. We'll then define get underscore events. And then from there, we'll create a variable called events. We're going to get our event class, and we'll use event.query. And from here, we could do like an event.query.all. But something that's nice about SQL Alchemy is that you can, there's a variety of different methods. The one we're going to use now is this order by. So after query, so I'll actually just get rid of the .all for now. So query.order by, order underscore by, and we'll do event.id, and we'll sort in ascending order, and then .all. So we only have one event for now, but as we create more events, it'll be nice to have them in a nice, neat order. So you can order by ID in this case. And since it's automatically incrementing, so the next, well, I'll prove it to you. So if we go to events, so I hit save. And if I want to create another, so let's say 100 milliliters this time. And now we hit send. It's got to be 2 events. And now we hit send. You can see ID is 2. If we have like dirty diaper, ID is 3. So it's automatically incrementing. So you could sort by created at, and that would work just as well. But since the ID is automatically incrementing anyway, just easy to sort by an integer, a single integer. Okay, so we are getting all of our events. So our events are going to order by the ID. From there, we're going to create an event list, which is going to be an empty array to start, or an empty list, excuse me. And then we'll loop over our events. So for event in events, event list dot append. And what we'll do here is, so basically we're grabbing all of the events. We have an empty array, and we're just going to push each event to this list. So we'll append the formatted event by saying format event. So we're formatting the event, each event in that events list. And then what we'll do is we'll return an object where we say events, and the events will be equal to that event list. And so now we save that, and if we go back to Postman, and instead of a post, if we do a get and hit send, now we have our events list, and you can see it's ordered 1, 2, 3. If I got rid of the order by, let's see what we get. Still in order, so that's nice. Might not always be the case, so I'm just going to leave that order by in place. Cool. So the next one that we'll do is we'll get a single event. And so if you wanted to do like an event details page or something like that, so we can make our decorator app.route. And this time we'll do /events/ID in the brackets here. And so this just indicates that ID is going to be a variable that we're passing in. query parameter. So it's going to grab the event slash whatever the ID is in the URL, and then we'll use that as a variable to pass in and grab that specific event. So this will once again be a GET request. And then we'll define GET event. And this is going to take in an ID, which is being passed in here. The ID, we can create a variable, say, call it an event, and we'll say event.query.filter_by, where the ID is equal to the event ID. So the ID being passed in is equal to the event ID. And then we'll say .1. You might see .first in some cases. .first is going to, as the name implies, give you the first result. .1 could error out if there's more than one, but since we're filtering by ID and the ID is unique, we shouldn't run into that issue. So we can use .1. Then we'll say formatted event is equal to format event, and we'll pass in that event. And then we will return the event as the formatted event. And we can hit save. And so now if we switch over and we do /events/2, we should see the 100 milliliter bottle. And we do. Okay, two more. So we want to take care of deleting events, and then we want to take care of updating them as well. So we've got our single event. Underneath that, we can delete an event. So same setup, app.route. Actually, let's go ahead and just copy this. But instead of a get, we'll do a delete. And so this is one example where, like, if you wanted to do like delete, you could do something like this, where this would be like if request.method equals get, then do this. But to my eye, it doesn't look as clean, because then you have like get and delete, and then your names are, you know, not as specific or whatever. So I like to keep them just one by one. But you could do this if you wanted to, but we're not. So let's undo that. Okay, so we've got our delete, and then we'll say, we'll define delete event, and same thing, it's going to take in an ID, which it's grabbing from the URL. So we will say same deal as before, where we're just grabbing that event, and we're filtering by ID, and we're grabbing one, and then all we need to do is db.session.delete whatever event that was, and then we'll commit it. And then we could say return event deleted. And if you wanted to do like an F string, you could say event parentheses ID, and then the ID that's passed in. This is fine as well. So let's try this. Bringing Postman back over. So we got our event/2. So now let's delete that one. And we can see event with an ID of 2 was deleted. Now if we go to get and we do events, now we can see just 1 and 3. So the last one we want to set up is our update. So we'll do app.route. And again, we can just grab this one actually again, and we'll update it. So we'll say edit an event. And this will be put. And we'll say define update event. And this once again will have take in an ID. And here we're going to grab our event, or we'll say event.query.filter by, and then the ID equals the ID. But we're not actually going to grab one. We're going to grab the list. There are a couple of different ways to update items in a table using SQL Alchemy. This is just one way of doing it. So we're going to grab the list, and in this case, it's going to be a list of 1. And then what we'll do is we'll say that the description is equal to the request.json at the description. So similar to our post. And then from there, we'll say event.update. And we'll have a new, you can see a new empty dictionary mapping. And from here, we'll say the description is equal to the description that we grabbed from the request. And then we'll also update the created at. So we'll say created at is equal to datetime .utc now, and then we'll actually call it. And then from there, we just need to commit. So we'll say db.session.commit. And we'll return our updated event. So we'll say event. And we'll format it, format event. And we'll say event. And now we can do event.one, which in this case, event is still a list, and we'll just chain on 1. So the reason that we did 1 here as opposed to up here is that update, this event.update, that method can be chained off of filter by. But if I were to do event query.filter by .one.update, that wouldn't work. So this is just my way of breaking it out. So now if I save this and I flip back over to Postman, and let's bring it over. So I've got ID of 1. So we'll say event/1, switch this to a put, and I'll change my description to be another 100 milliliter bottle, and I'll send this. And now I've got ID 100 milliliter bottle, and just to show you that let's say I put this to like 75. So let's look at the created at, and let's look at the description. So it's 75, and you can see the created at timestamp changed. So now if I make a GET request, I should still see that event, which I do. And if I go to all events, I've got the 75 milliliter bottle, and I still just have 1 and 3. So all of our endpoints now work. So the next step is hooking these into our front end. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll set up a React app just using create React app, and we'll create a very simple interface for listing out all of our events, editing them, adding new events, updating and deleting as well. So go ahead and come back for that one.